Hi, I'm Clay Kilgore from the Washington County Historical Society, and we're going to be talking about the Underground Railroad. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the Underground Railroad, and it's a really broad topic, so there's really no good way to go into all of it in a short period of time. So I just want to focus on a couple things and talk about Washington County with the Underground Railroad. But just before we get there, what is the Underground Railroad? There's a lot of answers you could give to that, but as most people know, it wasn't underground and it wasn't a railroad. Those were just kind of terms that they used. So it was, railroad was used because they used terminology from railroads to kind of hide what they were doing. And underground meant it was hidden. People didn't know what it was. But basically what the Underground Railroad is, it's a series of safe houses, homes, leading from the south to the north, where fugitive slaves that had escaped, could make their way up north and eventually maybe to Canada for freedom. But the thing to realize is there wasn't one path. It's not like everybody that escaped went from point A to point B to point C and, freedom. No, it wasn't like that. It was a series of homes, and it was scattered. And if four people escaped, they could take four completely different paths to get to the north. And so there wasn't one definite way that they went. It was just a lot of different people that were willing to open their home up to a fugitive slave to let them hide or to direct them to the next stop. And so when you look at kind of a rough map of the Underground Railroad, you'll see there's just lines all over the place, that show the different routes. But there was kind of a hotbed in southwestern Pennsylvania where you have a lot of fugitive slaves that went through here on their way north. Now, where are they going once they come through here? They want to get north. They want to get to Erie, Rochester, New York, because from there they could cross over into Canada. There was the James Latta warehouse in Erie. He had a warehouse. He was sympathetic to the fugitive slaves, and so when boat captains on Lake Erie were willing to take slaves, he would basically hide the fugitive slave until the boat captain came, and then they would take them across to Canada. So a lot of these escaping people came through southwestern Pennsylvania. But even in southwestern Pennsylvania, there wasn't one definitive route. There were, I could think of 8 or 9 stops just off the top of my head in Washington County where they could have gone. And so really it was just this large network of people that would help these slaves escape. And the idea is you want to escape slavery in the South, and you want to make your way up north. And you're going to take about any route that you can, but you had to be careful, because there were bounty hunters, there were people that were completely pro-slavery that were helping to capture these slaves and send them back south. So you wanted to be careful what home you went to, and that's why it was a stressful journey, because you never really knew who you could trust. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is some of those activities in Washington County. And the thing to realize is that I'm going to talk about one gentleman by the name of Francis Lemoine. Francis Lemoine was a doctor here in Washington County, but realize that Francis is just one part of this. I'm going to talk about him, but he's just one part of this overall network. And it was really the free black community that made it possible for these fugitive slaves to escape. They're the ones that aided these fugitives more than anyone else. The white landowning people that we might know their history, like Francis, who did help, they were a part of it, but it was that free black community that did so much to help these slaves escape, because a lot of times it was very it was not something that was planned. You might have a slave that's here with his master. Maybe his master, he's a personal service with his master, and he's in Washington County. They're traveling through for business, And at some point, he might just find, one of these free black men might come up to him and ask him if he wants to escape, and they leave right then. So it could be something that's completely not planned. That's just the spur of the moment thing. And that's where this community came in. But with Francis Lemoine, I want to talk a little bit about him because we're lucky enough that Francis's home still exists today. The Lemoine house is located on East Main Street in Washington. And it was a stop along the Underground Railroad. It is a National Historic Landmark of the Underground Railroad. We do know some fugitive slaves came through there on their way to freedom. And Francis was a very well-known abolitionist. Francis was born in 1798. He, growing up, had these ideas of equality for everybody. Male, female, white, black, didn't matter. He believed in equality. And so it was very natural for Francis to become one of these agents along the Underground Railroad. And so he was an extremely well-known abolitionist. He traveled throughout the country speaking out against slavery. It was even selected by the Liberty Party on their presidential ticket as vice president once. He was selected to run for the Liberty Party for governor of Pennsylvania on 3 different occasions. So this is a very well-known man. And he was completely against slavery. He thought slavery was one of the worst evils that existed. And so he wanted to help as many people as he could gain freedom. Now, he wanted to abolish slavery as a whole, but in the meantime, anybody that could help, he would. And so you see him not acting so much as a conductor or somebody that led fugitives along the path up north, but he was kind of like a central hub in helping to organize some of the activities here in Washington County. Now, how many people came through the Lemoine house? We don't know. We're lucky enough that we do have some letters that exist written to Francis or from Francis about his activities, but we don't know everything. We don't know if it was 20. We don't know if it was 200. We know it wasn't a lot. That's the thing that people don't realize is that over the course of 60 years of the Underground Railroad, you're not talking about hundreds of thousands of slaves that escaped. You're talking about thousands that made their way to freedom, which is still a significant number, but it's not as much as we might think. You're not going to have every day, 100 slaves escaping and making their way up north. It just didn't happen that way. So we don't know exactly how many came through the Lemoine house, but what we do have is a letter that's from 1847 from a gentleman by the name of Nelson Talbot Gant. And Nelson Talbot Gant was a slave. And in this letter, he is writing to Francis telling his story. Because in September of 1845, Nelson was he was a slave down in Loudoun County, Maryland. And he was, Loudoun County, Virginia, sorry. And he was set free in his master's will. So his master passed away and he was set free. But he didn't want to leave right away. You would think he's free, he'd want to get out of there as quickly as he could. But he didn't because his wife was still there. See, his wife was owned by another person, a mistress that owned her. And they were actually allowed to be married. See, Nelson had a little bit of freedom even as a slave. His master really trusted him and would send Nelson into town by himself to run errands by himself, and he never really worried much about him. And at one point, he had met his future wife, and the two owners decided it was okay for them to be married. Part of that was because it was security to them. He figured Nelson wouldn't escape without his wife and vice versa. Well, Nelson's set free. So what he decides to do is to start raising funds to purchase his wife's freedom. So he stays on the farm where he had been a slave to his master, and cuts firewood, and he sells firewood. So he raises the money that he thinks is necessary to purchase his wife's freedom, and he goes to her owner and wants to buy her. And her owner will not sell her. She refuses to sell Nelson's wife to him because she doesn't think that a black man can own another person. She doesn't feel that's right, that they are to be slaves only, not to actually own anything. So now Nelson has to leave because by law in Virginia, if you were set free, you had a year to leave. After a year, you could be taken back into slavery. So he had to leave. So he makes his way up north, and at one point, he's in the Lemoine house. He is taken in by Francis, who hears his story about his wife and wants to lend some help. So he gives him a little bit of money, and he puts him in touch with another gentleman by the name of Martin Delaney. Martin Delaney was he was part of the United States colored troops later on. But prior to that, he was a doctor in Pittsburgh. He was one of the only African-American doctors in Pittsburgh. And so Francis puts Gant in touch with Delaney. They end up working out a plan. He ends up in Zanesville for a little while. And with the help of other abolitionists, they come up with a plan for Gant to get his wife's freedom. So they figure, well, there's no way that his mistress is going to, or that her mistress is going to sell her. So they need to escape. So they work through a few people and they arrange for the escape to happen. On their second stop after he escapes with his wife, they are betrayed by another black gentleman. And you would think, why would this black man, betray them? He would want them to get to freedom, but he was promised more freedom and better treatment if he betrayed them. So he did. So they're taken into custody. They're arrested, and now Martin is held for about a month and a half. His wife's held for just a little under that, and they try to convince his wife to turn on him and to basically testify against him so that he'll be thrown in jail or go back into slavery, and she refuses to do it. Well, there's a gentleman down in Virginia that actually takes this case on for Gant, for Nelson Gant, and it's a white gentleman, and he takes the case and he argues that in court that Gant, it was not illegal for him to be with his wife because the masters had agreed that he could be married. And so the idea that they don't really know that he was escaping, they can't really prove that he was escaping with her, that he was just with her. And he wins. It's phenomenal that he actually wins this case. And so the court finds in his favor that two things. One, that he's not going to be arrested for being with his wife because he's married to her, and the masters let that happen, so it was okay. And secondly, they decide that he is allowed to purchase his wife's freedom. So with the help of the other abolitionists, he's able to raise the funds, and he purchases his wife's freedom. And they end up in Zanesville, Ohio, where they actually buy some property, and he becomes an extremely successful businessman. He has a coal mine, a salt mine. At one point, after he passes away, part of his land is made into a park that's named after him. In this letter that we have from him to Francis in 1847 is him recounting the story of what has happened since he first met Francis. So his time with Delaney, who he calls one of the finest men he's ever met, his the help from the other abolitionists, and his adventures down south in winning his wife's freedom. And so it's a great story because you actually have, this, not only is he able to gain his wife's freedom, he wins the court case. In Virginia, in the heart of slavery, they found in his favor. And so it's just an interesting story to see. And so, it's a little bit off of the topic of the Underground Railroad because, he wasn't necessarily escaping the first time he was set free, but it shows the network, because it was a network of these abolitionists and these people that were willing to help. Martin Delaney, who's a doctor who's helping along the Underground Railroad, he's an African American. You have these abolitionists that are white. You had Francis's wife that was a part of it, and so you have all these people that are helping in making up what is known as the Underground Railroad, and this network to freedom that these fugitive slaves or somebody like Nelson could use to gain their freedom and make their way up north. And there's so many stories like this. There's so many fascinating stories of the Underground Railroad. And it's all these people working together, whether they were white or black, men, women, everybody was, this network was working together to help these fugitive slaves. Eventually, as I'm sure the Civil War occurs, Lincoln abolishes slavery as a whole following the war. You have all these slaves that are now free. And one of the neat things about Francis is that he ends up giving money to a small school down in Tennessee to start a school for the newly freed slaves. So it was a school for these newly free men where they could receive an education, and it's called Lemoine Owens College today. It was just called Lemoine College when it was first started. It's called Lemoine Owens today, and it's still operating today. And it's a historically black school started by Francis Lemoine. So it's just, the Underground Railroad, it's wide ranging. It's not just one story. It's not just one route. It's not just, one person, saying what their experiences were. You have to put it all together, and you have to look at people like Harriet Tubman. We didn't even get into Harriet Tubman, but look at, what she did after escaping and then traveling back down south to help slaves escape. And then, one more story I'll tell you that I just find interesting. There was a gentleman, so we've got to go to the 1920s. And in the Lemoine house was living Francis Lemoine's youngest daughter, Madeline Lemoine. And a gentleman comes to the door and she answers. He knocks on the door, she answers. He begins to tell her the story of his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather was a slave down in Virginia who had escaped and has made his way up to Canada, and that's where the family still was. But the reason that he was stopping at the Lemoine house is because he was trying to retrace his great-grandfather's steps that he took all the way back, or from Virginia, the plantation Virginia, up to Canada. So he's reversing the steps. So he stopped at the Lemoine house, and he said the reason he knew to stop there was because his great-grandfather would tell the story of his escape, and he would say that at one point he was hid in this Lemoine house. And the reason he was hid is because bounty hunters had come and were looking for him, and they'd searched the house. Well, while he was being hid, he said he remembered that he was hid in a small movable room. And what we've been able to determine is that what they did, the Lemoine family hid him in the dumbwaiter. So the dumbwaiter was in a closet, and it was basically a small elevator that went from the kitchen in the basement all the way up to the dining room on the first floor. And so they put him in the dumbwaiter, which is a small box. It was just very small. It could probably barely fit in there. And they lowered the dumbwaiter between the floors. And when the house was searched, the bounty hunters didn't find him. And so once they left, they were able to get him out. And you see him, from this great-grandson being there, that he made his way to freedom up into Canada. And so it's just really a wonderful story to see what the different things that they would do, the hiding places, hiding in a dumbwaiter, and the lengths that they would go to gain their freedom, and to get away from the evils of slavery. So that's just a small portion of the Underground Railroad. If you want to learn more about the Underground Railroad, I recommend looking at the Historical Society's website. It's wchspa.org. And we are currently working on a larger exhibit on that. But there's some fabulous stories that can be told and more that you can learn in just the 15 minutes that we've been here. So thank you.